Let's say China. You take China.
China.
China. I love them. China. China. And I have to have my China. China. China because China. 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 China.
I know China very well.
China.
Northwest Wisconsin, where I'm from.
It's China to me. China. 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 You want to buy from China? That's great. Buy from China. Buy toys from China. China in particular. China. China. I have people that I know in China. 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 China.
Let me ask you about China.
China. I go to China. So don't tell me about China. I know China.
Yes, dear listener. I'll give you one guess what we're going to talk about on this episode. This is the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove podcast, episode 255. And I said to my wife earlier, she said, what are you doing? What are you talking about on the podcast tonight? I said, China. And she said, what, again? But no, we're really talking about China this time. So I'm Trevor. I'm the Iron Fist. With me, as always, is Paul, the 12th man.
Greetings, Earthlings.
And for the month of May, with us, as always, was the beer sponsor.
Ni hao, listeners.
So I said last week, look, let's talk about China, because it's in the news so much, and we obviously have been talking about China, but let's try and understand China and get to know it so that we can see what has shaped China and how do they think, because they do think differently to us, so we have to interpret things differently. So this is an episode where we're just going to look at China, Chinese history, Chinese culture, Chinese economy, the military, the Belt and Road, and predictions for the future for China. So basically just trying to understand a bit about China. So because it's in the news, and it's going to be in the news even more as time goes on. So
particularly after this podcast, right?
Particularly because we're thought leaders.
We are. We're trendsetters.
We are. In the chat room, Wheat Watcher and Will, good on you guys. If you're in the chat room, say hello. That's nice to know. All right. Well, why do a podcast on China? I was reading a little bit from a John Menadue blog where the writer was saying that there's a trenchant and sustained bias against China, he said, or she said, can't remember who wrote it. And looking at why that's the case, and it was identified three things, fear, ignorance and projection. And basically in this article says that while ignorance is not a direct cause of fear, it certainly feeds it. And also, when people are ignorant, there's a tendency towards projection. So if we don't know about others' motives, in the absence of alternative information, we tend to assume that they must be similar to ours. In relation to anti-China, there are now commentators questioning why we automatically assume certain things. So we may say, why does China's positioning of its naval forces directly off its own coast imply aggression or military posturing and not simply securing safety of shipping lanes or defence? So they may genuinely see it as something different. Because of their history, which we'll get into, they may genuinely look at it at a completely different way and with some justification compared to how we might look at it not knowing the history of what's gone on in that country. It certainly shapes how you view their actions in many cases. So we would have our own perceptions of actions and what they mean, and the Chinese are culturally very different to us. They've got a history that's shaped them to think different ways to us. So maybe when they do things, they're not actually thinking the same way we think they are. We're projecting our thoughts onto their actions. So that's all the sort of stuff that we'll...
And we tend to stereotype when we don't know much about people, don't we? And of course, there's just as much diversity and variety within the Chinese population as there is in any large population.
Of course, there's going to be a lot of generalisations happening here.
There will be.
And of course...
So excuse us, listeners, if we sound like we're generalising too much.
Yes. Hello in the chat room to Kobe and to Daniel, and thanks for that. Right, we're going to get into history very soon, but I thought we'd just mention geography, first of all, because the geography's there before even the history. And China has the longest combined land border in the world. It's got 14 nations that it shares a land border with. Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, India, Bhutan, Nepal, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Mongolia, and North Korea. That's a lot. And in addition, it's got maritime borders with South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Like, it is just surrounded by other countries, and there's got a lot of international sort of foreign affairs to deal with.
Did you mention Taiwan in that list? Or is that China?
Excuse me, Taiwan is a part of China.
You're right, and a maritime border with Taiwan. You're dead right. This article that I was reading did not mention Taiwan.
Wasn't brave enough to mention Taiwan.
No, yes. So, yes, Will says, but only one time zone, and that's true. We'll get onto that as part of their
Yes,
culture.
isn't that interesting? It's such
Yes.
a broad country.
Yep.
So
That's good input, Will.
Right.
Well done.
Yes. Well, we'll talk about that in culture when it comes to cohesiveness and being one, and that is part of the time zone.
And yet, ethnically, there are something like 56 ethnic groups officially recognised in China.
Really?
Yes.
The dominant group, of course, are referred to in English as the Han Chinese, and they are by far the majority.
90%.
Yeah, but there are literally, 55 other ethnic groups.
David in the chat room says, I don't disagree with your assertion about history impacting their actions, but they are currently engaged in horrendous human rights violations. We'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
Yeah. Let's hold on.
Pump the brakes.
Yeah. So geography is interesting. Like, that's a big country. It's about size of Australia plus about a quarter to a third extra on top.
It's a little bit bigger, isn't it?
Yeah. And a lot of borders to deal with, a lot of neighbours to deal with. So we're going to talk about history, and we were discussing how far back to go. Obviously, goes back thousands of years, Paul, with a lot of dynasties coming and going in that time. Ming dynasty, sort of well known for
vases.
for vases. That's right.
Yes.
That's what we know it for. Yes.
Yeah.
Often these dynasties would last for hundreds of years and
Yeah.
then disappear and come back.
And sometimes they would unify large areas of land, and then
Yes.
later somebody else would
Yes.
come and break it up and
Yes.
do things differently.
Yes. So that for our purposes, where we're trying to look at what history has shaped the modern day China, I think it's really important to get a grip of the Opium Wars. So two of them, basically, first in 1839 and the second in 1853. And really what we had was the British smuggling opium into China from India. So there'd always been some opium in China
Indeed, yeah.
used for medicinal purposes, but the British were bringing it in and people were getting high as a kite on it, and for mind-altering reasons they were taking it.
Yeah.
And this was causing a major problem in the Chinese country. So the
Do you know what? Just on that point, I read something that I didn't know before about this, and while opium had been used, as you say, in China before the British started sort of making money out of it by smuggling it in large quantities, I read that they didn't actually start sort of smoking it, in a sense, until they had adopted the habit of smoking tobacco.
Oh, okay.
Which was
mixing it in.
No, well, just the habit of inhaling fumes.
Okay, so
apparently.
the foreigners introduced the idea of mind-altering use of opium as opposed to the other use they were doing.
Don't know that it wasn't already being used in on a limited level for that, but it was tobacco. Of course, originally came from North America and spread around the world.
Bloody Americans again?
I know, but it was in this case it was the indigenous Americans.
Oh,
so don't blame those
that's okay.
middle-aged white fellas.
Culturally,
Yes.
Yep, that's okay.
But of course, the English and others, transported tobacco around the world, and so the habit of smoking tobacco had been introduced from America, I
Okay,
think.
that's interesting. And so then it took off.
And then
where it
opium
hadn't
followed
previously.
as an inhalant.
So anyway, it was causing problems in China, and the Chinese Jiang Ying emperor passed many decrees and edicts making the trade illegal in 1729, 1799, 1814, 1831. but smuggling still occurred as the British paid smugglers to take opium into China, causing the population to become more and more addicted. It continued. In 1939, there was a letter written by an emperor to Queen Victoria pleading for the contraband to stop, and that was ignored. So they lost patience and decided to confiscate some of the illegal opium, although they tried to say to them, look, we'll give you some tea in exchange. Like, we're not going to take this off you. Have some tea instead. And they said, no, that's not going to work. And, of course, so China resorted to using force, and the British got their troops organised. A much superior naval fleet could
Had
just...
far superior ships.
Yep.
And
And that's important.
armaments, yeah.
Put a pin in that idea that a far superior naval force came and kicked their butt way back in 1839, and that has not been forgotten. Put a pin in that. So basically kicked their butt and said, forced China to sign a treaty which ceded Hong Kong Island and some surrounding smaller islands to the United Kingdom in perpetuity, and established 5 treaty ports in Shanghai, Canton, Ningpo, Fuzhou and Amoy. And it also demanded $21 million in payments to Great Britain for having the temerity to try and stop the smuggling of illegal opium.
Does that sound like a fair arrangement to you?
Fair to the British. So that was 1839, and again in 1853, there was a new imperial commissioner in Canton. He was determined to stamp out the illegal opium trade. Had a go at it, of course, again defeated by the British. Resulted in another treaty which forced China to pay reparations for the expenses of the war, open a second group of 10 ports of European commerce, legalise the opium trade, like legalise it now, and grant foreign traders and missionaries right to travel within Australia. So
Australia.
within China. Where did I get that from? Anyway, so then we had a whole bunch of ports, and we're now up to 15 sort of like zones where these foreigners could basically do what they liked in China and conduct trade, not pay taxes, and basically treat the place as its own, as their own, and that's really ugly from a
So the
Chinese point of view.
main European countries that were involved were the United Kingdom, Great Britain, France, Germany was there,
Netherlands?
the Italians were there,
Netherlands?
Well, I'll list them in.
possibly.
Well, I'll list,
you have a
East
list?
India Trading Company would have been involved.
I'll list them in the sense of the Boxer Rebellion. So,
Oh, okay.
so in 1900 there was a Boxer Rebellion, and you've heard of the Boxer Rebellion? Or
Absolutely. yeah.
Yes.
I
So-
studied Chinese
yeah,
history.
So what? And the Boxer Rebellion were called the Boxers because
Because they fought.
yes, they were like kung fu fighters.
That's right,
And
they
it was
were
like
fighters.
considered Chinese boxing was the sort of kung fu fighting. So
Okay.
these guys who started this rebellion in the Boxer Rebellion were sort of kung fu fighters like David Carradine style.
But not as cool as David
No.
Carradine.
So
They couldn't take on the Navy, so they thought,
what they
we'll
thought
box
they
them.
could, they thought they could. They thought their kung fu stuff was
They
going to be
also
enough.
had these beliefs about, I think the Boxers also, I know the Taiping Rebellion, which was an earlier one, they had these ideas about bullets wouldn't hurt them. you know?
Yes, yeah, it could be in the same mob. I think they thought they were going
Oh,
to be
it was a
fine.
different group,
Okay,
completely
right,
different group.
Okay.
yeah.
So anyway, so in the Boxer Rebellion, villagers in North China had been building resentment against Christian missionaries who ignored tax obligations
Again,
and abused their extraterritorial rights to protect their congregants against lawsuits. So remember, in the Opium Wars, special dispensation, you can travel throughout China and do the fuck what you like. Well, the Christians took advantage of that, and so the Chinese again got sick of it. Again, got smashed. This time there was what they called the Alliance of 8 Nations, which was America, Austro-Hungarian, British, French, German, Italian, Japanese and Russian. All formed an alliance to kick the butt of the Chinese and say, no, you don't. This isn't your country. This is ours. Okay, so that's when we talk about
Colonialism at its worst.
Yeah, so
It's not a proud moment.
yeah, and really, you know, in other countries with the colonial powers, they basically took a whole country and controlled the whole thing. But China was too big, I guess. So really, what they did was control these ports and these centres of commerce, and said, well, provided we control these, we don't care really what happens in the rural countryside. Grow your rice and make your products, provided it all finds its way into a port and we can export it. That's fine. So, and so when we talk about the 100 years of embarrassment for China, it all starts with these foreign countries coming in and just punching them on the nose on 3 different occasions.
repeatedly.
And just doing whatever they liked. It gets worse. We'll get onto that. So really we've got an imperial sort of empress type situation up until 1911 when the empress at that time died and we had a bit of a revolution ball. So
And there had been revolutionary elements building up to that. It didn't just happen overnight, by the way. From the late 19th century, intellectuals and scholars and various people who were dissatisfied with the system had been travelling abroad. You know, a lot of them went to Japan, for example. Others went to America and Europe. And they had been learning from Westerners these new ideas about republics and democracy and things like that. So it had been building up over a period of time. And as you say, in November 1911, they had the official sort of announcement that China was going to become a republic and do away with the emperor system. So at the beginning of 1912, they announced the establishment of the Republic of China.
Yep. But China being such a big place, very hard to gain control over the whole place, and really it descended into, between 1916 and 1928, a kind of a warlord era. So regions controlled by warlords, and we had the rise of, now how would you pronounce the, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang? The Kuomintang? Kuomintang.
Yes.
Okay. Doesn't look
Chiang
like that.
Kai-shek-
Doesn't look like that on my screen.
Yeah, I know. Chiang Kai-shek, look, I don't speak Chinese, everybody, but I've, hung around enough people.
Kuomintang.
Kuomintang. And the guy, Chiang Kai-shek, we usually call him, and I saw in another book today, the Chinese pronounce his name completely different, something like Jiangxi or something like that.
Right. Okay. So we'll just say Chiang Kai-shek, and I might say Kuomintang.
Kuomintang.
Kuomintang. Okay. So
Which means something like the Min is people, and Guo, what was it? Guo is like common people or something. It's like the Common People's Party or something like that, I believe.
that would make sense.
Yeah.
So that was sort of a nationalist party, and they were looking to take control, and at the same time there was the communists developed, led by Mao.
Not initially,
No,
by the way. Yeah,
eventually.
he wasn't the actual
Not in the early days.
central founder, but he was one of the first.
Appeared
first
later.
ones to come.
And
up.
initially, the communists kind of were within the Kuomintang as part of them, and
Yes, they joined.
Yes, and
together.
they kind of worked together, but then they had disagreements
Yes.
and broke up. So
They had a sort of a bit like our Liberal Party and National Party. You know,
Right.
sometimes they're friends,
Yeah.
sometimes they hate each other.
Yeah, well, it got very bitter. It's not going on. So you've got this new sort of, you've had thousands of years of, monarchy, basically. You've got this foreign countries running around taking whatever they wanted to, and you've got this sort of new political movement trying to establish itself, which is now splintered into the Kuomintang.
Yeah, they started separately.
yes.
And then at some point in the early 1920s, they sort of came to an agreement that they would work together for the national good.
Yes.
But, I think they were always suspicious of each other and secretly probably planning to eventually ditch the other one.
Yes.
But they managed to work together. And even in 1927 in Shanghai, there was actually the Kuomintang, led by our friend Chiang Kai-shek, actually tried to destroy the communists.
Yes.
And they had this big roundup, and they apparently recruited local criminal gangs to help the police. So they rounded up several thousand Communist Party members and basically topped them all.
Right.
They murdered, I think in Shanghai, at least a few thousand.
In 29.
In
1927.
1927 in April.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, moving on to 1931, we had Japan effectively seized Manchuria, which is an area in the north. So,
northeast,
so they basically took control in the same way that these different foreigners had different ports, that they basically said, look, we're in control here, leave it to us. The Chinese more or less did that to the whole of Manchuria in the north. And
So North Korea and South Korea didn't exist at that point in time?
It was just Korea, yeah.
right.
It was just Korea.
was
But
just
Manchuria is above Korea.
However,
Is
we
that-
should
is that how-
mention that
Manchuria is part of more of the mainland, a big chunk of the mainland in the
yeah,
north.
it's quite a large province
China
in the
proper,
northeast.
a big chunk in the north.
Okay.
Yep.
It's up sort of where
Above North Korea.
yes,
Yeah.
where North Korea butts
Where the
onto
peninsula
the
would,
mainland.
yes. That,
It's up
The
around there.
Korean Peninsula.
But we should mention that Korea was actually a Japanese colony at that time.
yep.
It didn't just go. They didn't go from Japan and invade Manchuria.
Right.
They took control of the Korean Peninsula in 1905, and in 1910 they declared it a part of Japan. So they actually just moved.
So
from,
before that, it was China.
no,
No, it was Korea.
it was Korea. So the Japanese. They had a war with China too in 1895, and they took control. They took possession of Taiwan
Yep.
as sort of spoils of war.
Yep.
And then in 1905, they invaded and took control of the Korean Peninsula. And in 1910, they declared it was part of the Japanese Empire.
Right.
So the Japanese troops went from Korea directly
Into
across
Manchuria.
the border into Manchuria. And then,
Yep.
and you guys have seen the movie The Last Emperor, right?
No.
What was
Might
his
have seen
name?
bits of it.
Yeah. I forget his name now. But he actually left Beijing at some point when he was a young adult. He ended up as a puppet emperor in Manchuria under the control of the Japanese.
Okay, right, yes. So just on the Korea bit, of course, heading forward to the end of the Second World War, and they say, well, Japan, you can't have the things that you've taken recently. Korea then becomes
You're
up
not-
for grabs, end up with a big fight over Korea. So, so anyway, so 1931, Japan effectively seized Manchuria in terms of control. And in 1934, we have the Long March. So,
Yes.
Right.
Paul, the Long March.
The Long March. The Long March was where, after the massacre of the communists in in the late 20s, they basically had to scatter into the countryside and hide, and they had considerable numbers of men, something like 80,000, I think, went on the Long March, 80 or 90,000 people went on the Long March, and I think only a few thousand survived the Long March. A few thousand out of 80 or 90,000.
Essentially, there was a stronghold kind of, or safety zone in the north.
In the far northwest, yes.
So they basically escaped the clutches of the Kuomintang
Kuomintang.
and set off on a very circuitous route to the north.
Yes, being harassed and attacked along
Yes.
the way by the Kuomintang armies.
And so it was quite a feat
Led
of military.
by Mao.
Yes.
Led by Mao, yeah.
6,000 miles, 80,000 set off, and only 9,000 made
That's it, yeah.
And that's after accounting for the fact that they picked up some along the way. So who knows how many of the actual original 80,000 actually made it.
Some
they-
probably
Did
deserted.
they walk that far?
Yes.
6,000
on
miles.
foot? Yeah.
Yes, took them a year.
Some
Yeah.
probably deserted, but a lot were just dying or being killed in various clashes they had with the nationalist army.
Yes. Although, I guess the whole thing about the communists was that their sympathies were with the peasants. So there would have been some friendly support amongst the peasantry because they were about the peasants. But we're talking about a country that's now just run by various warlords who had all sorts of loyalties to different groups. So what a minefield, skipping your way through China for a year to get to some safe haven. Like, well done, Mao.
I'm sure they would have had quite a lot of popular support among the peasantry in the countryside. But of course, as all armies do, they would have just taken what they needed anyway, whether the peasants gave it to them or not.
Got to live off the land.
They lived off the land, which is basically living off the peasants in the land.
Yep. Right. And then we just have to understand that in 1937, Japan invaded full on at that stage. And basically, where they'd sort of had Manchuria as their territory that they managed, they now just said, well, that's just Japanese territory now. And they started full-scale sort of operations on taking over China. And
although the Japanese also never tried to control the whole countryside.
No.
They basically stuck to the coast and the main...
because it's too big.
The main, metropolitan centres.
This is the thing, it's so big. So you kind of had a three-way fighting where the communists and the Kuomintang... Can I just say the Kuomintang? Kuomintang and the Japanese fighting each other at different times. And to some extent, the communists were letting Chiang Kai-shek and his group do most of the fighting because they were just trying to save their energy and escape to some extent. But they'd fight the Japanese when they'd come across them. So,
and they actually did coordinate to some degree together to fight against the Japanese at times.
Yeah, a very complicated sort of three-way situation happening then. And of course, in 1937, now we're just thinking about shaping of their current current Chinese sentiment. We had the Nanjing massacre. Nanjing, we're happy with that pronunciation.
I'll let it go. Look, I don't speak Chinese, so I'm not an authority on Chinese pronunciation.
Where basically the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army murdered Chinese civilians and disarmed combatants. The numbers wildly vary, it's anywhere between 40,000 and 300,000. And Nanjing was the capital at the time, but it was a particularly brutal, nasty raping and pillaging of a city and that had completely surrendered. And it was actually, there were foreigners in town who were witness to all of this. And just thousands of women raped every night, and pregnant women had their babies cut out of them, and just the most awful, gruesome,
the bit that I
terrible
read
things.
about that was that the Japanese soldiers were having competitions to see how long it could take them to chop the heads off 100 Chinese civilians.
Yes.
And they were reporting it in the Japanese papers like it was a baseball result.
Yes.
You know?
So I've had some Chinese
British
homestay.
colonialists look like angels.
Make them look like good guys. I've had some Chinese homestays with me over the years, and one boy in particular would have nothing to do with Japanese because the town in his family history was this town, and he felt very, very strongly about the massacre that had occurred in 1937. And as best I tried to say to him, live and let live,
Put it
he
behind
wasn't.
you,
Yeah,
mate.
he wasn't up for it. So, although I can also remember when my dad was alive, we also had a little Chinese homestay boy stay with us for a couple of weeks. Maybe he was only young. He was only like 9 or something. He was tiny, and we took him down the coast to show him the beach, and he met my dad. And my dad made the comment, "Oh, they've brought one of the enemy." But my dad had been a prisoner of war on the Burma Railway. He was entitled to say what, but he was okay. So, but yeah, he did say, "I said,
People
brought one
who
of the enemy."
Experienced something like that firsthand, of course, would never ever forget it. But the Chinese government, the communist-led Chinese government, have very deliberately cultivated that historical resentment against the Japanese.
Right.
And even when I visited China about 6 or 7 years ago, young Chinese people, if I asked them about it, they would say, we don't really like the Japanese very much. Others were more open-minded, but I did meet young Chinese who told me they didn't like the Japanese people.
I think Chinese television still has a lot of movies
every
showing
day.
anti-Japanese sort of
Yes.
movies. Yeah.
That's right. They have war movies.
It's like Bridge Over the River Kwai is sort of their their version of that every day.
It's like the movies we used to watch when we were kids, the Americans against the Germans.
Right.
For them, it's the Chinese against the Japanese.
Yes.
And the
yes,
Japanese are the bad guys, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
What's
if
the
you-
feeling like in Japan about Chinese?
It's very
they're in
different.
denial.
Very different because the Japanese basically decided after the Second World War was finished, when they were rebuilding Japan, in their wisdom, which I don't think was wisdom, they decided to bury it. And they do teach history, and they do teach Japanese people, of course, that there was a war, that Japan was,
much.
involved, but they don't teach very many of the gruesome details.
Yeah, and compared to the Germans, completely different. So the Germans really
Apologetic.
own it and say, this is what our forefathers did, and how bad was that? Whereas nowhere near that sort of recognition by the Japanese.
And in fact, I've detected among some young Japanese acquaintances a sort of feeling that Japan was defamed excessively.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because they don't learn all the gruesome details. I saw a documentary film where some old Japanese ex-soldiers who had served in Manchuria were interviewed. And these guys wanted to come clean. Before they died, they wanted just to tell the truth of the matter. And they were describing horrific events, where they'd go into villages, they would literally rape the women, kill everybody, burn everything. And these old guys they really felt bad about it, and they wanted to get it off their chest. That it was horrific.
Yeah.
And of course, the 12th man is qualified to speak about Japan because you lived there for.
I did live
many
there,
years,
and I
didn't
also studied Japanese history and
Yeah.
politics and society, as well as Chinese.
How long
as
did
part
you
of
live there?
In Japan, about 6-7 years.
6 or 7 years. Yeah.
Right, moving on. So, World War II. And my reading of history, and I was looking at the history of the world from the 20th to the 21st century by J.S. Grenville, was the book I was referring to. And essentially, America was looking at Japan, and Japan at that point had invaded China and basically was looking at some way of keeping out of war with Japan, and they were trying to reach peaceful negotiations to avoid it. But the sticking point was China, and the USA said, it's a condition of any settlement we have, you cannot have China. And the Japanese insisted that they must have China. So really, there would have been some, arguably some sort of settlement amongst them. Japan needed the resources.
Yeah, they've got nothing, have they?
Yeah, small island and
No coal, no iron.
So-
or-
They actually did have some coal, but not in those
but
vast quantities.
they certainly needed the resources, and they saw themselves as a world power that that needed to acquire territory as a legitimate world power does. And they saw
They-
all these other countries in
Exactly,
China and
exactly.
thought, well,
they had seen the European
Yeah.
colonists,
Yes.
colonialists, imperialists, and they said we can do that too.
Yep.
And they were in the process of creating what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity. I forget the last word, but anyway,
right.
that was what they called
They
it.
were
Yeah.
trying to create an empire.
Well, they had this idea that rather than Europeans colonizing other parts of Asia, they should be doing it.
Yes.
Okay.
Asia was their territory, their patch. Yeah. And
Okay.
so when we look at the way that the USA is viewing China today, it wasn't that long ago that the USA was protecting China and saying,
And in fact, China was an ally of the Americans
Indeed.
during the Second World
and in
War.
the Second World War, China was an ally, fighting against the Japanese. So,
History's messy. Isn't
And
it?
Japan was our ally during the First World War.
indeed it was. And if you go to Western Australia, to Albany,
Yes.
there are photos from the First World War as Japanese ships
Yes,
escorted our
that's
ships across the Indian Ocean.
Escorted
So-
our troops.
Wow.
Yes, yes.
Wow.
So it is messy. Yes. So China basically USA, one of the reasons they went to war was over protecting China, hence Second World War. One of obvious other reasons going on, not least of all Hitler. But anyway.
You can sort of understand the Japanese position, though, in a way, because they would have been looking at the Americans and saying, well, you know, you guys are sort of spreading your tentacles down through Central and South America. So aren't you doing the same thing as us?
Yeah.
You know?
Of course. Yeah. Yep.
So the Japanese started a fight with China,
Yep.
America, Australia.
They're
Yeah,
very
because they basically said, we're taking China.
They're very confident,
Yeah.
the Japanese.
Indeed.
And in 1905,
They took on everyone at once.
they had a naval battle with the Russians and soundly beat the Russians
Yeah.
because
So
they had
the
new
Russians, they took on the Russians as well.
British-designed warships.
Right, moving on. So, 1949, Mao wins the Civil War. So they've been battling with Chiang Kai-shek, and he and his followers from the Kuomintang.
Kuomintang.
Look, I got to write. Hang on. Just going to say it.
Just
Guo.
point
Guo.
at the 12th man every time you go to say it, and he'll say
Yep.
it for you.
Min
In
Dang. Dung.
Dang.
You know dung, like cow dung?
Kuomintang.
That's it.
Kuomintang.
One of the listeners is
that
going to make a
means-
YouTube clip of all of our pronunciations.
Kuomintang.
Back to
That's
back.
when I go to if I have
Yeah, I don't know the tones for it. So
right, okay, you know, but I feel if I was at a Chinese restaurant and the trolley's coming around, Kuomintang.
Yeah, they'll give you a funny look. won't they?
We'll talk about Chinese restaurants as we go on in
Oh,
hour
wouldn't you love a yum chana?
in hour 4.
Yes,
when
I
we
hope
get
you've
to-
got plenty of sleep, listeners. It's going to be a long one.
Okay, so 1949, Mao wins the Civil War. How did he win it? What was his secret of his success?
I think the Kuomintang were fatigued from fighting the
from
Japanese.
fighting the, very good was. That is one of the reasons. Yes, they had taken some heavy hits in that fight, and so
I think it was a pretty close call for a while. You know, like the communists didn't always have the upper hand in that civil war, is my understanding.
Yep.
But they finally did prevail.
yep, and so Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang
Yes.
they
Nailed it.
retreated to what we
Taiwan.
call Taiwan,
Yeah.
which was an island off the coast
Yes.
of mainland China.
And you know that the Chinese insist it's part of their territory, and quite fairly, I think, in many respects. But did you know it was not even a proper Chinese province until 1885?
Well, over the
Oh, because the
millennia, it
Japanese
must have.
owned it.
It was a backwater.
Okay, but over the millennia, it must have come in and out of Chinese control at different times.
Well, it was a backwater. It was a kind of, you know,
A rock over there that what's
Yeah,
it good? What's the
that's
good? of
right. It had a bunch of Aborigines
Right.
living on it, as we
Okay,
know.
right.
And do you know the Aborigines on Taiwan are actually Austronesian, which is they're in the same sort of language and cultural group as the Malays, Malay people, like Indonesians, Filipinos, Malaysians, that group, and Polynesians too.
Right.
So they're in that group.
They still exist as a group.
Yes.
Yep.
So anyway, they've retreated to Taiwan.
The
and-
Republic of China.
Yes, and that is considered the legitimate China in the UN until 1971.
It's the
And-
Republic of China.
That's right.
And it had the seat at the UN Security Council instead of mainland China. Till 1971, dear
Yeah.
listener.
That's
Until
amazing, isn't
everyone
it?
decided
This is ridiculous.
Mainland China, we're probably going to get better value out of dealing with mainland China.
Yeah.
Mainland
terms
China
of-
being the People's Republic of China.
Exactly.
Right. Alex in the chat room says a big factor in Mao's win was the capture of lots of Japanese military hardware when they surrendered. Good point, Alex. Thank you for that. Very good. Right. So Mao's won the Civil War. Remember last week we were talking about communism and the naming of things doesn't necessarily mean, like the People's Democratic Republic of Congo didn't mean it was democratic. So Mao wins and he calls his government the People's Democratic Dictatorship. You're closing
Is
your
that
eyes.
true?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, the people's
Democratic
the people's
dictatorship.
democratic dictatorship.
So it was like the USA,
Well,
a democratic dictatorship.
that's according to my history book that I just.
Really?
Yeah, you might fact check me on that one, dear listener. But that's what it was called in the early days.
Really?
So Mao, of course, is a red hot Marxist-Leninist. Like he's full bore on the good solid communist theory, like hardcore. So his first target was landlords. Let's return the land to the peasants. That
It
was
was all about class. Wasn't
yes.
It?
Yep.
So, and so that was his first step, and then so he took power in 1949. If we fast forward to 1958, 1960, we have the Great Leap Forward. Paul, thoughts on the Great Leap Forward?
Yes, the Great Leap Forward.
Not so great and not so forward.
Very, very not
Good
great.
intentions.
Yeah, well, Mao's intention was to develop industry and ramp up production, both in industries in the city and also agricultural production. But he figured that the way things were, where the land was divided up into a lot of very small plots for each family,
Yep.
he decided to, make them into big communes
Yes.
where people would work together for the greater good.
Yes.
But unfortunately, the old landlords, they were the managers of the land. They knew what they were doing. And even the individual small farmer peasants probably knew what they were doing with their little plot of land. What they found was when they grouped them all together into, big mobs of people allegedly working together, it just didn't work as well. I guess when you're not working on your own plot of land, you don't feel there's much in it for you either as an individual. So you might not tend to work as hard as you did if you were working on just your little piece of land. But anyway, production didn't increase rapidly, apparently. But the worst thing about the Great Leap Forward was their attempts to industrialise. And Mao had a few harebrained schemes. The most notable of which was his idea that instead of building big steelworks, as happens in
Yes.
industrialised countries. Thanks,
Yes.
Warren.
There'd be a series of smaller industrial sort of
he
things.
said
Yes.
everybody can build a blast furnace, a little backyard blast. Well, not everybody, but
Yes.
all over the place, people were erecting these improvised small blast furnaces, and they were going house to house collecting scraps of metal that they could put in and melt down
Right.
and use for something useful. So people were literally giving up their garden tools and their cutlery and all sorts of stuff that was actually quite useful.
Yes.
But what they found was these little blast furnaces didn't actually work. They would melt the metal, but they had no efficient way to get the molten metal out and do anything with it. So what they ended up with was these blocks of molten metal that they couldn't do anything with all over the countryside,
Yes. Yep.
So it was a catastrophe.
Yep. So the Great Leap Forward was about co-ops being merged into huge communes, including agriculture and industrial units, and it was chaos, and production plummeted, and we can put him down for about 30 million deaths as a result.
That's right.
So that's a pretty chaotic event.
I also read that Mao, or I shouldn't say Mao, but anyway, the communist government had storehouses of grain in certain areas, and they wouldn't distribute it to the peasants. They were keeping it perhaps for the military or perhaps for some other purpose, and they were literally just letting people die of
Starve to death.
starvation, and millions did.
So around this time then, Deng Xiaoping, who would later become leader of China, was one of the sort of higher-ups, and he was involved in trying to reform China out of this mess. Mao thought he was a bourgeois and a betrayer of the revolution, and he had to be very politically clever to survive those times, to try and get sort of change, but not end up on the wrong side of Mao. So you have, it's full credit to your political skills to survive that
And in
process.
fact, he was, during the Cultural Revolution, we should mention that one as well.
We're going to get to yes.
okay.
Okay. So 1966 to 68. So we've where the great leap forward was 58 to 60. So Mao takes a bit of a breath. About 6 years later, he starts the Cultural Revolution, which was akin to a kind of a civil war where these Red Guard units were formed and they would denounce teachers, professionals, and anyone in authority, with Mao's wife being a big player in the whole situation. So
Yes.
go ahead with
She was
Deng and all that.
famously. Oh, Deng Xiaoping. Well, he was forced to, what's the word, where they denounce
self-criticise
themselves?
or
Yeah,
something
self-criticise.
like that, yep.
But what I read about the Cultural Revolution was, unlike Stalin, when Stalin wanted to get rid of his enemies, he did it from inside.
Right.
You know, he would have people arrested on trumped up charges.
Yes.
They'd be interrogated. There were show trials you've probably read about, and then they were executed. Mao decided that rather than do it internally, he would just encourage the common people to take up the cause of revolution, you know, constant revolution. And they did the work for him.
Yes.
And they would, you know.
So these Red Guards were youth, essentially, who were basically maniacal in their approach. Like even their parents they would attack, or they would not help save from others.
No, and their teachers especially
Yes.
were targeted.
So these were sort of beatings and abuse.
Sometimes they were,
and
people were killed.
yes, yeah.
It was brutal.
and even members of the Communist Party, like the hierarchy
yes.
itself, was rattled because they were authority figures.
That's right.
So nobody was safe.
Except Mao
Yes,
and his very close people.
yes. So
And
that
that
was,
went on from 66 to roughly 69, I think.
Yep, somewhere around there. I've got 68 on my notes, but yep. So we had the Great Leap Forward, we had the Cultural Revolution, and then after the Cultural Revolution, we had what was described as forced migration, where Mao turned on the Red Guards and other people and moved about 20 million people into the countryside to be re-educated. So it was a sort of a forced migration into rural areas soon after, and that cleaned up the Red Guards who'd been, even Mao thought, had been running amok. But the thing about Mao was he had absolutely no loyalty to anybody. He was a bastard. Like, he just turned on
Ruthless.
people. And, very difficult man. So, all right, moving on. At some point, Mao gets past it, and you say Deng Xiaoping?
Well, I pronounce it Deng.
Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah.
He takes control. And so he is one who wants to modernise China and move it into normality and what we see as normal business. So he was the one who kick-started all that. And what I read in this book was that in Soviet Union, it was really hard to make change because of all the vested interests that people already had control of their little spheres of influence. And why would they vote to change anything? Because they're powerful people. But the Cultural Revolution had just had gone through the party and the elite and had completely decimated so many people with vested interests that it was kind of easier for Deng to get things done because there weren't the same rusted in vested interests because the Red Guard had rooted them out and created havoc. So he was kind of in a chaos situation that allowed him to probably act quicker than he could have otherwise.
He didn't really institute the reforms until Mao had died, I think, which was 76, was it?
Right.
When Mao died, 76 or
not-
77?
Not too sure, but he was certainly, that's what he wanted to do, and he would have been working as best he could given
probably.
the circumstances.
Yeah, when Mao was in his dotage.
Yep.
Yeah.
So he reversed.
So Mao's power came from his control of the military, I assume?
Well, even the military got a bit divided by the Red Guards. So
Really?
he had this cult. He created a sort of a, like Stalin, he created a cult figure
A
sort
cult of
thing.
personality.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he had his little red book had come out, and it was this
I'm
cult
just
of
thinking, it's a
personality.
wonder when he turned on the Red Guards that they didn't turn back on him, you know?
Well, at that point, he probably used the military to shift them into the countryside, and everyone was happy to get rid of the Red Guards.
And
at that point.
there were actually cases where the military was sent out to suppress the Red Guards.
Right, yes.
So they didn't have everything
Yeah.
there.
So
when
his power
so
did
when he
come from the
abandoned the Red
military.
Guards and said that's too much, he just used other powers to Yeah.
He was a military leader, wasn't he? So that makes sense.
Yes, but he was crazy.
He was better as a military leader than he was as a peacetime leader, in fact.
Yeah.
There was one other campaign that it's probably worth mentioning, and that was in the mid-1950s. So before the Great Leap Forward, there was something they called the 100 Flowers movement or something, and it was this idea that
Sounds nice.
everybody was encouraged to say what they really thought about everything,
Yeah, let 1,000
to
flowers
criticise the
bloom.
party or anything. It was basically, okay, we're just going to let everybody say exactly what they really think. Go for it, guys.
Let's have an idea shower.
That's right.
Yeah.
And guess what happened to the people who criticised the party?
That's right. Mao used it as a means of finding out.
That's right. He rooted out his enemies
To get rid of his enemies. 'cause
by
he said, "Oh,
inviting them to criticise the party.
that's right, yes. So people, the smart ones, wouldn't say too much because they thought, hang on a minute, he
this
could
could
turn
be a
on me.
trap.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it was.
It was indeed, yeah. Right, so Deng's in control, 1986 Tiananmen Square massacre. So uprising,
31 years ago.
yeah. So, Paul, thoughts on that?
Oh, well, it was a fairly spontaneous movement, is my take on it, among particularly young Chinese, who probably quite rightly thought that the country had developed enough economically and materially, and now it was time to liberalise the political scene a bit. So they were demanding, and of course by this time young Chinese people had some exposure to what was going on in the outside world, in the West, of course, and got to see Western movies and could see how affluent people were living in Europe and North America and Australia and Japan, the old enemy. And they were like, well, that seems to be related to a liberal political system. So, yes, we want that too.
Yep. And of course it was crushed.
It was totally crushed. And it wasn't just in Beijing, by the way. We think of it as the Tiananmen Square incident. And Tiananmen Square is a large square which lies between the large government buildings, what we would think of as the Parliament building, like the Great Hall of the People on one side, and on another side is the old so-called Forbidden City, which was the old Imperial Palace complex. So it's a very large square, and that's where the students and protesters congregated for several weeks until, as we know, it was crushed.
So I think the government brought in a lot of outsiders.
Sorry, what I was going to say was it wasn't just Beijing. It actually, similar things, perhaps not quite on the same scale, I'm not sure, but there were similar protests in other Chinese cities. So it wasn't just Beijing.
Anyway, that little note of wanting democracy was quickly snuffed out. And
The one thing I learned from my research was that the original gathering was because a former Communist Party leader had just died. A guy by the name of Hu Yaobang. And he was a former Communist Party leader, but he worked to introduce democratic reform in China.
Yes, interesting.
So that was the original purpose of the
Because he died.
demonstration was
Yeah.
just a recognition of his death, and then it turned into a let's push for democracy.
And there were one or two other members of the top ranks of the party who actually visited the protest site to express support, sympathy, whatever. And one in particular, I know, he was basically put in under house arrest and stayed under house arrest for the rest of his life after that.
Okay, we've got to move on. So in the early 2000s, according to my history book I read, they actually considered removing the word communist from the name of the party.
Really?
But they thought people might think, well, I'm joined the Communist Party, and if this isn't the Communist Party, we'll start another Communist Party. And so they didn't want a competing party to be started up, so they decided to keep the name. We were talking before last week about are they communist or something else?
Yes.
Just because communism is in the name, they actually feel they don't want it, but they
Seems
couldn't get rid of
crazy,
it
doesn't
because
it?
it might encourage an opposition movement, which of course they don't want. And again, I read in another part that said the party today represents a de facto political protection racket for those in private business. So that's one way of looking at it. One other thing I wanted to mention in the history was the Taiwan Straits crisis. So in 1995, Taiwan was having some elections coming up, and the Chinese were considering some sort of missile testing and other things in the area as a sort of warning to the voters of Taiwan to vote in the correct direction. And this was seen as an intimidation. And so I think it was Clinton administration gathered a few warships together and sailed around in Taiwan to say, don't fire any missiles in this area. And it did stop the Chinese from doing that.
But didn't they sign some agreement in 1992, Taiwan and China, which Taiwan then reneged on? That was my reading of it.
I haven't heard of that.
Yeah.
But,
I'll research that. You keep going.
okay, all right. So that's an important thing to remember as well when we're looking at this whole South China Sea and the creation of these islands and these fortresses that are being built there. Because as sure as eggs, when China was again humiliated by the Americans sailing their war vessels in the Straits of Taiwan, they said, we've got to do something to make sure this doesn't happen again. And now they've built up military capacity on those islands, and also just in terms of ships.
Which are quite far away from Taiwan, I should add.
Yeah, but in terms of the whole
But you're right.
region...
In principle, they wanted to be able to say, this is our backyard,
Yep.
and we will dictate what happens here.
And if the same thing was to happen today, I don't think the Americans would be brave enough to sail their ships around there.
They still do it, do you know?
Well, in the same way that they did it
A few
then,
weeks ago, they sailed a couple of ships through the Taiwan Strait.
yes, but in that situation, they would think twice about it. It would put pressure on it. So when we look at why has China gone and created these man-made islands and put these fortresses on them and built up its naval power, they must be considering an aggressive move against the region. You could say, well, look at their history. The British Navy belted them on the nose on several occasions, causing them to lose all sorts of stuff during the Opium Wars. Plus, in recent times, the American Navy just sailed in and did whatever it wanted to. So if I was the Chinese after those incidents, I would have done the same thing. And, you know, if you were a Chinese leader looking after Chinese interests, you'd do the same thing. So when we consider it in that light of all that history, it does give it a different flavour.
It's absolutely understandable.
Yes, yeah. So that's the whole point of this particular podcast, is to put these things forward and go, well, from their point of view,
Challenge your thinking.
Now I understand some of that history. I get it. Yep.
Yeah. So the 1992 consensus is a political term coined by the Kuomintang politician Suu Kyi, referring to the outcome of a meeting in 1992 between the semi-official representatives of the People's Republic of China, of mainland China, and the Republic of China and of Taiwan. And they come to a consensus, and the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China have now a disagreement on what that consensus actually was. But the
They can't look
Communist
at the
Party
document and see it.
the Communist Party of China only recognised the consensus that Taiwan is now to be officially recognised after 1992 as part of mainland China.
Right.
But from the reading that I did, the Kuomintang then got voted out and a new party was installed in Taiwan, and they said, we don't recognise that agreement.
Right. Okay.
So
But surely
now
the
that's why
Taiwanese...
Taiwan is
surely
kind
Tai-
of a country on its own, but kind of not.
But
And
surely the Kuomintang would not have said, oh, yeah, Taiwan's really kind of part of China. Like, they wouldn't.
so the
Ironically-
Kuomintang claims that such a consensus exists with different meanings of China.
Right.
Do you know,
So
ironically,
we're part of
okay,
China,
okay.
but what
So-
does China
So
mean?
they're just bullshitting each other, where they're just trying to come to. No, this is not a. There's no halfway point. There's no compromise between Taiwan and mainland China. Like there can't be.
well, interestingly, there's a lot of Chinese investment in Taiwan.
Yep.
And there are Taiwanese companies who have factories in the mainland.
Right.
So there's commerce going on between them.
Yeah, but there's no
the UN
halfway
doesn't
point in
recognise
terms of.
Taiwan, though.
There's no halfway point between the two of them in terms of recognition. You know, then there's no way the Taiwanese are going to give China any sort of formal control over their
Although-
island
No,
nation.
and neither is there going to be.
And there's
an
no way
agreement
that
the other way.
No way
So-
that mainland China is going to recognise that it doesn't have the right to do that.
Yes,
So, there's no. So they'll draw up a document that have weasel words and different interpretations to try and kick the can down the road from Taiwan's point of view, not so that issues are not forced.
One more interesting fact in the last election that they had just recently in Taiwan,
Taiwan, yep.
the Kuomintang, which is the old party of Chiang Kai shek,
Oh, they're back in.
no, they lost the election, but they actually were, part of their election platform was closer ties with mainland China. Isn't that bizarre?
Right.
And the Democratic Party, or I forget what they call them, the party that won, which is the party of the current president, were saying, no, we want to be independent.
I wonder if they'd been infiltrated.
Well,
the Kuomintang. Yeah.
Yes.
more than likely.
I wonder if they'd been infiltrated.
More than likely, the Communist Party has agents all over Taiwan.
Yes. So
As you'd imagine.
that sounds to me like that could have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the same
And
way.
they're aware of it, of course, and they go to great lengths to try and weed out the infiltrators.
Okay, so that's history up till today. That would have taken Cameron Riley and his podcast about 3 months to get through. Cameron's in the chat room, so that's why I mentioned
He's
it.
probably
It's-
pulling his hair
it's
out
what
as
he
well.
probably is. Chinese history in a nutshell. Sorry, Cameron, for rattling through that in that short period of time, but I'm sure you understand. Let's talk about culture now, because this is the other thing that shapes people.
Indeed it does.
So I Googled Chinese culture and came up to a website, and I've got a link to it. And a couple of different things to think about in terms of seclusion. So for 2 millennia, the Chinese Empire was one of the most advanced and innovative civilizations in the world. The Chinese considered themselves the epicenter of the world for centuries. So the dynasties showed no real interest in getting involved in global politics. As Western and Eastern worlds advanced trade and began to globalise, China continued to be a secluded and conservative country into the 20th century. So life was largely contained in the country's borders, with a closed economy until 1978 and closed borders until 1974. So,
Would we call them xenophobic?
well, maybe, or just a firm belief that China is the beginning and the end of what's important.
Yep.
So when people talk about
They got
expansion,
lots of similarities with the United States. Don't they?
well, I can't find any yet. Because what I'm saying is when you're thinking about expansionist China that is everybody's bogeyman at the moment, the history of the country and its thought process until quite recently has not been expansionist. It's been very inward looking compared to most other countries of it's part of the culture of the place. Is fair comment?
Yeah.
Now you could
Yeah,
say
absolutely.
that's completely changed in the last 20 years or whatever,
Probably
but you,
spent more time fighting each other than fighting
but you have to say that
external nations.
they
and
haven't
states.
been particularly interested in external matters historically.
Because they've been
Okay.
fighting each other.
So, well, Paul, in terms of the basic shape of China as we know it today, is obviously at the edges there's been movement to and fro, but is it kind of where it's been for a couple of millennia or not?
Not really, no.
Right. Okay. They
No,
quite a lot in recent.
The Han Chinese civilization, the Chinese proper, if you like, was the North China Plain, and to some extent, the Yangtze River, which flows into the sea around Shanghai or somewhere like
Right.
that. So there were these two major areas of Han Chinese
So of the current,
dense populated areas,
Right.
and then they little by little moved south and moved west into areas in the mountainous western and southwestern part of China and the northwest. In fact, Manchuria was occupied by the Manchus, or the Manchu as they call them, which were a different ethnicity, believe it or not,
Okay.
and with a different language even.
okay,
But the Han Chinese, who spoke basically Mandarin Chinese, as we call it, they spread out over a period of hundreds or thousands of years. They gradually spread out and conquered and incorporated all these outlying regions, which were occupied by ethnically different people.
Right.
As we know, 56 ethnicities in China. They weren't always part of China.
fair enough. Okay, now the older generation and rural Chinese tend to value traditional culture and try to preserve and uphold it. On the other hand, Chinese youths and city dwellers tend to be more accepting and enthusiastic about progressive ideals. Nevertheless, the country maintains a fundamental understanding of what it means to be Chinese, and one of these things is Confucianism. So, Confucianism promotes the idea. Now, this is really important in understanding China, I think.
I think so too.
The idea that relationships between people are unequal and that everyone should have defined hierarchical roles. For example, ruler and subject, husband and wife, father and son. It teaches that when this natural inequality is accepted and respected, it becomes easier to maintain harmonious, stable relations between individuals and therefore in society as a whole. The Confucian logic of obedience, responsibility, and adherence affects many aspects of Chinese behaviour and attitudes about virtue, and their sense of duty and societal cohesiveness is encapsulated in the principle of Li, social cohesiveness.
And that extends all the way up to the emperor, by the way. Yeah.
So rather than fighting for equality, there is an acceptance of unequal roles and a respect of what your role is, and to perform that role in terms of
bit like a dog pack, really.
in terms of the social in the interests of social cohesiveness. Now that's very different to modern Western culture, particularly American individual freedom is paramount. Sort of.
Don't you know we are currently living in a patriarchal hell?
According to
another
Clementine
episode.
Ford or someone like
another
that,
episode.
right? Is that what you're saying? So yes, dear listener, thinking about China, bear in mind that sort of Confucianism sort of thing running through their thought processes.
There was also the idea of the mandate of heaven. Were you going to talk about
no,
that?
you said so.
The mandate of heaven was the idea that the gods or whatever supernatural powers there were watch what's going on. And if the emperor or somebody in a position of authority falls out of favour with heaven or with the gods, something bad happens. And there are signs, like if there's a flood or a natural disaster or a war, the people could interpret that as a sign that the emperor or whoever's in charge has lost the mandate of heaven.
Okay,
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Also, the social organisation of China is characterised by people's interdependence. Individuals are taught to keep to themselves and respect the law and authority to maintain societal harmony. The Chinese consider national unity and cooperation to be essential for society to function harmoniously. This is reflected in the most fundamental foundations of the culture. For example, all regions in China follow the same time zone, despite the physical landmass spanning 5 geographical time zones. This provides for national sense of belonging and equality. Also, all behaviour and communication in China are influenced by the concept of face. Individuals usually act deliberately and with restraint to protect their self-worth and peer perception. Conservative conduct is the norm, as people don't want to stand out and or risk losing face by doing something that is considered inappropriate.
I like
See
it.
that in Japan as well,
Indeed,
that sort of
yes.
face.
Very much so.
So,
Not as forgiving.
well, not about forgiving, it's
It's
about what is considered a
avoiding
proper...
mistakes, isn't it? It's about avoiding doing things that will
cause somebody to lose face.
bring yourself or your family into disrepute.
Yes. So when our Prime Minister says, what the fuck went on in China, let's send in weapons inspector-like people to
didn't
root
say
out
that.
what
Yeah,
In
that's
its-
been beat up a little bit, I think.
he said we need to be able to send people in without the consent of the country involved. I read the quote. So
But
you
there was
know,
no mention of.
he didn't say
weapons of
fuck
mass
off.
Destruction.
But essentially he said we need to be able to send people into China whether they like it or not to check out what's going in the wet markets if something happens. So when we talk about the Chinese reaction to that, we've got to understand face.
Yeah.
Like if you
Look, I take your point, Trevor.
So-
I don't think he said it repeatedly, though, did he?
you only got to say it once. Why do you have to? He
But
said
how
it
do-
once.
how
He
has
meant it
lost,
once.
How has he lost face by doing that?
No, the Chinese do when somebody says.
We're sending
we can send
inspectors.
front
Oh,
people
Whether
in.
you like it or not, yes.
Allied with a history of foreign intervention where they've had foreigners running around doing what they like for 100 years of embarrassment. You know, you obviously do not understand
Touched
China.
a very sensitive nerve.
Exactly. That's the point. So,
But he didn't want to come across as a paper tiger either. He had to be forceful. He had to assert his authority.
no, the point is he
them
was
as well.
never going to get that. China was never going to concede that, so don't bother asking. Instead, to save face for the Chinese, you would say, look, what
Beg.
can we do together to cooperate so that in future, when something happens, what do you, China, offer us? Like, you don't just say,
And
we.
their response would have been, no, bugger off.
It might have been. But,
So same result,
but-
really.
But no, different result, because under the first option A, China says, fuck you, now we're going to look at your barley and your beef and whatever else we might think about because you've now caused us to lose face.
Yeah.
So, and under both, you're never going to get from them the forced entry into their country. Why piss them off over things that you're never going to get?
It was a very poorly judged comment.
Yeah, it was stupid. So, okay, another concept is Guanxi.
G-U-A-N-X-I.
Guanxi.
Guangxi or
Guangxi,
something like that?
yep.
I don't know.
The principle of Guanxi commits friends, family, and at times business colleagues to assist one another. Violating Guanxi can lead to a loss of face or honour. Guanxi plays a large role in business interactions and relations. It refers to networking. And the saying is insiders are different from outsiders. So this whole idea of networking together, you might do business with somebody because they're part of your network more so than because of a price or some other deal, like, you know, this sort of interconnected networking. So that's part of it. And here's the interesting one, is on politeness and courtesy. So perceptions of politeness and courtesy in China differ from those in Australia. Traditional Chinese courtesy rests on the lifelong hierarchical relationships reflected in Confucian ideology. Those relationships are already clear, meaning the Chinese do not feel the need for constant verbal reinforcement through courtesy words like please, thank you, and excuse me. Okay, so the relationships that we talk about of husband, wife, master, servant, the other ones we said which are unequal, they're there, they're known. You don't need to use courtesy words like please, thank you, and excuse me because people know their place in the hierarchy, and saying those sorts of words creates a formality and distance that should not exist in their culture.
Okay.
Interesting idea.
So when Scott Morrison talks to Xi Jinping, he should not use words like please and thank you.
Or excuse me.
Really?
Indeed.
But he's not one of his insiders.
But he would be considered on the same level.
Yeah.
So if he used
those
If you
words.
said, "Can we please come into your country and conduct?"
Well, if they're having a lunch together, and I'll get you an example where Scott Morrison and Xi Jinping are having lunch together, right? Those sorts of courtesy words actually create distance between people. So they act as a buffer or a space indicating formality and distance. So from a Western perspective, the contrast seems confusing. For example, when at a restaurant amongst friends, a Chinese person will usually pour tea for everyone present at the table before pouring their own,
yeah,
right? Yet they may not say, "Excuse me," when asking for someone to pass them food.
or thank you if someone's poured them a cup of tea.
Indeed. So these
That's
are just
considered rude.
yeah,
almost.
because you've created distance.
Distance.
You've inserted an unnecessary formality that has created an iciness.
That's interesting, isn't it?
So, so in that way, it could be perceived as rude from our point of view, but not from theirs. So, respect and courtesy are exhibited in different ways.
Religion? Are you going to get to religion?
Well, that's Confucianism to some extent.
Not
It's not
exactly
religion.
It's,
not a
it's
religion.
more an ethical system
Yeah.
than a religion.
Did you want to talk about the full-on?
Falun Gong
Yeah, did you or not? Because I wasn't going
But
to.
Falun
but-
Gong was a minor cult.
was.
Yeah, the
It
real
still is,
religion
isn't it?
of the Chinese is
Still
ancestor
exists.
worship.
Yes, Wheat Watcher, the Bali decision was likely made before COVID. Just allow me some poetic license for fuck's sake, okay? Okay, we did that last week, Wheat Watcher. Come on,
Don't let the facts get in the way of Trevor trying to make a point.
that's right.
Wheat
Come
Watcher.
on, just all right.
Yeah.
Do you want to? So we'll move on. Where was I?
I was fascinated by the Falun Gong.
Right, we'll go on.
Yeah.
Talk about it.
Well, okay, I've got
Yep.
some notes here.
Yep.
So the Falun Gong is a new religious movement, and by new, it officially started in 1992.
That is new.
That combines meditation and Qigong exercises with a moral philosophy centered on the tenets of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. The Chinese Communist Party views Falun Gong as a potential threat due to its size, independence from the state, and spiritual teachings. In 1999, the CCP initiated a nationwide campaign with the intention of eradicating the practice. Here's the good bit. The Falun Gong protests grew until April 1999, when over 10,000 Falun Gong practitioners gathered near the central government compound in Beijing to request legal recognition and freedom from state interference. So the biggest religion wanted separation of it and the state, which is the complete opposite of religion, or Christianity at least in Western countries. They want to bring the state and religion as close together as possible. So even to this day, the Chinese Communist Party are trying to shut down these Falun Gong practitioners, and
Thousands have been arrested.
at least 2,000 have died as a result of abuse in custody.
And there is
So they see it as a threat to their rule.
Yeah, and there are reports that the thousands of them were imprisoned, and a lot of them
And
were
treated really
used
badly.
for organ harvesting.
Organ harvesting, yeah.
I don't think they were donated. Somehow.
Yeah, no.
A lot of
They donated without their consent.
a lot of the Chinese asylum seekers are claiming asylum because of that religion. So they're saying, "Oops, I'm here, and if I go back, I'll be persecuted." So that's one of their key reasons for seeking asylum here in Australia.
It does sound like a bit of a kooky cult, I have to say.
What's the difference between a cult and a religion, Paul?
There is no difference. But I don't know a lot about it, I have to admit, but what little I have read, after I'd read it, I thought, probably not a group I'd join.
They're pretty big.
Yes.
Well, they were.
Yes, they were. But officially there is freedom of religion in China, but in reality, the Chinese Communist Party just wants to control everything.
Unless it threatens the CCP.
Yeah. Do you know there are reported to be more Christians in China than there are by far in Australia? There'd be more Christians in China. I think there's tens of millions of Christians in China.
Yeah, but only a small percentage of the
Of
population.
the total population, that's true. But I've always wondered why Christianity would be popular to people with such a long and very deep, cultural tradition of their own. Doesn't that?
I wonder why Christianity would appeal to anyone.
Well, I agree, but
It would be Christianity with a very Chinese flavour, I would imagine.
I dare say.
They'd work it in with existing Chinese.
Mix a little Confucianism
Yeah,
with
exactly.
it. Probably.
Yep, definitely.
Christianity is adapted, of course, as we know,
The-
by
the-
whatever culture
Indeed.
adopts it.
The brand that they would be selling in China would be quite different to the brand they're selling in Latin America. Like, it's for sure it would have been adapted, and yeah. So,
Speaking of the Falun Gong practitioners seeking asylum, one of the things I learnt during my research that after Tiananmen Square, Bob Hawke granted asylum to Chinese students immediately after, but apparently 90% of them were actually supporters of the Chinese Communist Party. So
right. Yeah, well, that's where we get to now. Is what is the support of the Communist Party? And-
diaspora.
Yeah. Well, no, within China, I want to talk about.
Yep.
So, I found this very interesting article by a guy, Martin Jacques, who's an economist and author of a book called When China Rules the World. And he wrote an article for the BBC. And he compared in this article about how, at the time he was writing it, America was about to vote and elect Donald Trump. Meanwhile, the 18th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party would simply be selecting a new president and prime minister, and saying that the contrast couldn't be greater. So Americans in their tens of millions turning out to vote. In China, the process of selection will take place behind closed doors and involve only a relative handful of people. And you are probably thinking, America at its best, China at its worst. The absence of democracy. China's Achilles heel is in governance. This will be China's downfall. And this guy says, I want to argue quite the contrary. So he says that democracy does not itself guarantee legitimacy. So think of Italy. It's always voting, but the enduring problem of Italian governance is that its state lacks legitimacy. Half the population don't really believe in it. So he says that the Chinese state enjoys greater legitimacy than any Western state. How come?
Among the people, you mean?
Indeed. In the course of, in the case of China, the source of the legitimacy lies outside the history or experience of Western societies. So he talks about, it gets back to this Confucianism issue. Are you pointing at your watch?
Oh, I just glanced at it, sorry.
Just getting warmed up.
Yeah.
We might divide this
Time
into two parts.
passes quickly, doesn't it?
Now, this is an important part because
I'm
you're
sure it
always
is.
talking about bloody Chinese and their lack of democracy and totalitarian state.
Indeed.
So this is
We're
important.
getting to the crux
Pay
of the podcast.
Pay attention
Yes.
is what I'm asking. So legitimacy of the Chinese government and get back to the Confucianism and your role in society and societal harmony. And
Hierarchy.
basically the role of the government is to ensure Chinese civilization and harmony as an ultimate goal in the minds of a Chinese person, so that if the society is harmonious, if it is successful, if Chinese civilization is prospering, then that's what matters to the Chinese. And whether they got to vote for that or not, it's not. It's
Certainly
not so.
prospering.
And we should remember they never have.
No,
They've
so-
never had a tradition of voting for their governments.
Yeah. So,
They don't know what they're missing out on.
Like that.
well, even the ones who do, like, again, I've had Chinese homestay boys here who've watched me head off to elections and come back on a Saturday morning, and we talk about the election process, and I say, so what do you think? Does it annoy you that in China you don't get to do that? And they go, no, couldn't care. Like, it honestly did not worry them. And they had been here for several years, of an age where you're becoming politically aware. and they really thought, provided the Chinese economy is ticking over and is successful and the Chinese civilization is running, that is what is important to Chinese, and they're prepared to not even give up. They don't
Those
care
young people
about.
have been indoctrinated, though.
Well, do you know what comes to my mind
but
is the
but
Romans.
the counter argument to that indoctrination, because what I'm trying to say is you've got to look at it with their culture and their history and their way of viewing the world.
But also
and-
the
and just-
indoctrination
Well,
that's going on.
but it's just a different way, and it's not necessarily wrong.
No, because that's the way it's always been, basically, is you've had...
You're not a fan of indoctrination, though.
I'm not, but I'm a fan of understanding empathetically
Yeah.
how other people view things.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they could, I mean, these kids have had access to the internet and the news for, they're with us for 2 years in Australia
You've heard
watching.
of the Great Firewall of China, though, haven't you?
Yeah, but they've been living in Australia for
Oh,
2
okay,
years. Like they've seen it operating. They're quite worldly aware in that sense.
But have
you
they
could
taken...
say the same thing
but-
of children that have been indoctrinated into Christianity. I mean, they've got access to the internet as well.
You could, but the whole point of this podcast so far is to say, look at what shapes countries and shapes people. And I'm just simply saying that when you've got a culture that is shaped by Confucianism and a recognition and acceptance of unequal roles, then for that person, it's not that important to vote, provided the society is harmonious and prospering.
That's right. And the Communist Party effectively acts in the same role as the old imperial bureaucracy. They make sure that the machines of society work. And that's their job. That's their role.
Yep. So I've got here in this article, it says in a series of surveys by Tony Sachs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, he found that between 80 and 95% of Chinese people were either relatively or extremely satisfied with central government. And Pew Global Attitude Surveys 2010 found that 91% of Chinese respondents thought that the government's handling of the economy was good. Meanwhile, the UK figure was 45%. So they're happy with how the government's managing the economy, and that's
Well,
and if the
there's a lot of
society is
progress
harmonious
been
and
made,
working.
hasn't there?
Yep. So, of course, it doesn't mean that they're conflict-free. Of course, there are groups who are going to not be happy, and there are strikes, and there are agitations within. But essentially, you've got to view it from that point of view, where they have a different priority system based on their culture, and that priority system.
Is it that different? Even though we have elections here, people are basically not that fussed who is in government in Australia, so long as everything happens properly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Week Watcher in the chat room says there are plenty of young people in democracies which couldn't care less about voting.
Absolutely.
It's true. So,
That's a good point.
so there we go. Let me just see here. It goes on.
But I think the fact that they have successfully raised the standard of living for the vast majority of Chinese people, and very significantly raised their standard of living, people are like, well, the system works.
And
There wouldn't be a country in the world that has raised the standard of living more in the last.
As dramatically and
Yeah.
rapidly, probably, and in such large numbers.
And what this article was written a while ago, but it's saying that we're seeing that in terms of the success of the Chinese economy, having central control actually really helps you to manage an economy at a macro level. So not good in some ways, but excellent in
Decisions
others.
get made quickly.
Exactly. And
You get on with it.
exactly. And we saw with this coronavirus, a central, strong authoritarian government can do things.
Has its advantages.
Indeed. And increasingly, we're going to see countries around the world, Australia included, acknowledging, all that talk about small government, that actually didn't work real well for us. We've discovered we need some big government in certain areas now. And it's a world where a strong central government might actually be very, very effective in getting things done. So increasingly to be taken into account as we look at how we manage societies. It's an interesting thought. Right, that's culture. Any other thoughts on culture before I move on? Because I'm conscious that it's an hour and 29 and Paul was looking at his watch earlier.
And we still have to decide, is China a communist country or not?
Cam Riley, are you still in the chat room? Because I'm getting people looking at the clock here saying I'm going too slow. So come on. Okay, let's look at China's economy. Let's look at that. Let me just see. Okay. As of 2019, 100 million Chinese are in the top 10% of wealthiest individuals in the world. So that's people who have a net personal wealth of 110,000. So they've got more than America in terms of people in the top 10%. They've got the most number of billionaires, and they're second in terms of millionaires.
But that 100 million, that's not 100 million of millionaires. It's a sort of middle class, isn't it? It's a sort of...
There are
100 million in the top 10%.
There are 3.5 million millionaires in China.
Yeah, 3.5 million, not 100 million.
No, there's 100 million
No, people who own... there's 100 million Chinese are in the top
10%.
Top 10% of the wealthiest individuals in the world. So
In the world?
Well, if you line up the poorest person in the world and
lots of poor
the
people
most
in the world.
and the most wealthy person in the world, if you've got 110,000, you're in the top 10%. Yeah. So China has 100 million people in that top 10%. Yeah. It's got 658 billionaires and 3.5 million millionaires. But in terms of per capita economic output, it's 70 in terms of 180 countries. So it's
70.
It's about a middle income. There's a great disparity developing between these super rich Asian princelings and your average.
And the United
Chinese.
Nations still considers it as a developing country, right? I think it has some sort of concessions.
The world, okay. My understanding of that is that it was classified as a developing nation under the World Trade Organization.
World Trade Organization, not
but
the UN, sorry.
It did not take advantage of the special benefits available to a developing nation.
Right.
So, yes, that is my reading of it. So they qualified but said we don't take those particular advantages. So in terms of extra trade benefits that you're allowed as a developing nation, they didn't take them. So there you go.
I thought I came
Fact
across a
check me
news
on-
article recently
Yes.
where there was some other country.
Do you know what? Fact check me next week. But,
Maybe,
But
yeah.
that's my
Maybe one of the
reading.
dear listeners
Haven't you
can-
heard something about some
Google
country
that.
saying, well, we have to stop treating China as a developing country?
Donald
because-
Trump said that. And I read an
Scott
article.
Scotty from marketing. has
Yeah, one of them.
suggested
It was either Trump or Morrison, same thing. Said exactly that, and the article I read said, yes, they're nominally a developing country, but they have not actually taken advantage of the extra concessions available. So it's bullshit. And essentially, that was the article I read. Was in response to that statement.
that. So if we took that privilege away from them, it wouldn't make any difference.
That's exactly right. Yep. But they actually talk to other developing nations and form voting blocks with them when they want to get things, more numbers on there. So, okay. So that's sort of economy. Military. We're so scared that the Chinese are going to invade us.
Not next year, but
Yeah. So, should we be scared? And let's look at their history for starters. As we said earlier, they've been quite an inward-looking nation for a long time. Like, they weren't really interested in the rest of the world. As a matter of disposition, they were like, we're not really keen to get involved in the outside world. So it's not inherent in their DNA that they are they're not like the Mongols, like who just like, or they're not
the
like
Japanese.
They don't have, or Alexander the Great is not, coursing through their veins in the sense of expansionary long-term tendency. So, granted,
They're not
might
like
be-
the British.
They might have a new development and a new love for expansionism, but just looking historically, you would say not the most expansionist
Well,
group.
I would add something to that.
Oh yeah,
Historically, the Chinese considered that China was the apex of human civilization. They didn't really know much about Europe and other civilizations, but at the time when it was still just China and their neighbours, China was the top, and all the neighbouring states were considered vassal states. Now, you know this expression, vassal state. It's like somebody
pays a tribute.
it pays a tribute every year, you know. So I think that they have, in a sense, carried on that tradition, where they say we are big China, Vietnam, Laos, you know, Burma, Korea. You are our vassal states, and they still treat them like vassals. They do.
Do they?
Oh, absolutely.
And they're moving
How?
towards
How?
Australia,
How?
becoming one of those.
How do they
tribute states.
treat? How do they treat them as
They
vassal states?
insist that none of those neighbouring states get too uppity in their relationships with China. That's how.
A vassal state demands tribute. Have they demanded tribute?
Well, in some way, they will be exacting some form of tribute,
What do you mean?
I'm
they,
sure.
What do you mean? What have
In-
they said?
in terms
what have they
of
said to Indonesia?
Favourable trade relationships.
What did they say to Indonesia about you getting too uppity? Stop that. What did they do?
Possibly they haven't perhaps insisted on Indonesia, but they've certainly brought pressure to bear on the other smaller states.
Is
around
what they've
China.
done in recent weeks with Australia? Is that what you're talking about?
I've-
Australia's getting uppity.
I think in a lot of ways you could put Australia in that relationship. We supply them with raw materials for industry. We supply them with food, fibre, whatever else, even holiday destinations. But we are absolutely never considered to be on the same level as them.
Do we consider them to be on our level?
I think in
When we say to them,
Look,
we'll
yeah,
send
don't
in
go
our...
back to that. Don't go back to that. We're sending in the things. You can't harp on about that all the time, Trevor.
But it's in response to that they did what they did.
We've had a relationship with China for decades now. It didn't start with Scott Morrison saying we're going to send in weapons inspector type.
Xi Jinping and most of the leaders have come to Australia in the days of Howard and Abbott and Rudd and Gillard. The Chinese leadership were here every year.
Yes.
All
and
the time.
how did the Australian politicians treat them? With the utmost respect and deference.
Yeah. And now, when they treat them like shit, they say, well, if that's what you're going to do, here's what we're going to do.
They didn't all treat China like shit. That was one incident where Morrison obviously made a very poor choice of.
Okay, before we
But yes, China does very much look at Australia as a vassal state, I would say, in a lot of respects.
well, if that's your definition of a vassal state, that's
We don't pay them
agree.
tribute,
Well, then that's not a vassal
but
state.
they treat us as not on the same level.
Well, then,
Trevor.
because Australia has not treated them on the same
I
level.
don't think that's true at all.
I've
Australia
just
has-
given you the classic example.
That's one incident. Look, Australian politicians have been bending over backwards
To try and sell stuff.
to cultivate good relations with the Chinese.
Yeah.
The
to sell stuff.
Chinese have reciprocated when it was in their interests, but when it isn't in their interests, they do what they did a couple of weeks
Guess what?
ago.
When it's not in Australia's interests, guess what we do? We do what's in our interest.
Yes, but we don't insult them.
We
And
did. That's the whole point of this
No, no,
whole goddamn
that-
podcast is to say how we insulted them.
That was one incident. One incident. Look, I'm talking about years and decades of relationships. And you can see when our politicians and business leaders meet the
But
Chinese,
it's-
they act with extreme
But
deference.
it's more than that because Australia, for example, with the dumping, Australia said you're dumping, right? So when you say there's only one incident, I can quickly find you the whole dumping thing where China says no, you haven't treated us fairly on that. So they would say no, you didn't treat us fairly in that regard. So if I could have 5 minutes to think to myself, you could list a number of times where they could say, well, really, we were conducting our military operations off our coast and you guys bitched and moaned about it. And all we were doing is defending our territory. So
Who was that?
when we talk about actions in the South China Sea,
South China Sea is not their territory.
no, but that's the point. Is from their point of view, they can say you've insulted us. So when you say there's only one time that we've insulted them, you could easily come up with others which, from their point of view, are an insult.
Yeah, from their point of view. But my point is that if you look at the pattern of political interaction and relationships, not just Australia, but the leaders of Western countries since about 1980 or since they started transforming to a market economy, Western leaders have been bending over backwards to cultivate good relations with the Chinese.
Here's what we can do. For every time you reckon China shafted us, I'll find 2 times that the US has shafted us, yet you don't complain. Anyway, let me just finish off.
There might be some parallels with our relationship with the US. I agree with you on that.
Let me just finish off with military.
Okay.
We're shit scared that China's just going to come down and invade us. And we think we have to cozy up to America in order to save ourselves because they're too big, we're too small, we couldn't possibly defend ourselves.
I'd say a lot of Australians are scared about
Indeed,
that, and
indeed.
it's born out of ignorance.
Indeed.
I'm not scared, but after that podcast that you did,
With Han too, my mate.
yes,
Yes,
I was
he's
even less
ex-military.
scared after that.
Yeah. So
that was a great episode. If
yeah.
you want to look that up, dear listener,
Look
have a
up
listen to that
on the
one.
website Han2 HAN.
If you're a little bit scared about China invading, have a listen to that episode, and you won't be.
Yeah,
afterwards.
and I've got a link to an article from Hugh White in the Monthly. So Hugh White wrote a book. So he's a professor of strategic studies at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, Australian National University, and the author of the book How to Defend Australia. Now, I disagree with his ideas about nuclear deterrent, but on other things, I think he's spot on.
Yeah, it's pretty sharp.
And basically, what he is saying is that there's a difference between sea control and sea denial. So, sea control is where you can sail your ships around an area of sea and be quite confident they're not going to be blown up.
That's sea control.
That's sea control. Sea denial is where you can deny somebody that ability, where you can look at an area of water and say, we can stop anybody who wants to come across that area of water if we want
Or
to.
threaten if you come into that area,
We'll blow you up.
we'll blow you up.
Which is what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea.
Exactly. It's a defensive thing. So from basically Hugh White is saying that because of modern technology, with the ability to launch missiles and with submarines, it's really so much easier to conduct sea denial than it is to conduct sea control, meaning it's much less expensive and much more effective, and the technology has moved that way and is increasingly moving that way, where with anti-ship sort of missiles and whatnot,
Which fly a long way.
either land-based or from aircraft or from submarines, one missile knocks off an aircraft carrier. And it's incredibly tough to control an area of sea, comparatively easy to deny an area of sea. And so Australia can, if we're willing to spend enough money on a decent submarine fleet and a decent aircraft group, we can punch the nose of China. China today could not attack Australia. Could not do it. We
Not
could,
today.
even with our meagre defences at the moment, we could stop them. And as China spends
On
trillions
our own, without the help of the US.
and
yeah.
as China spends trillions of dollars increasing naval power, we only need to spend billions of dollars because we're only doing sea denial.
Denial, yeah.
Flying
So
those fancy French submarines.
yeah, well, our problem is the submarines that we're buying are the wrong ones, too expensive. So he's basically saying we need more submarines, more aircraft, but essentially a country like Australia can defend itself. We do not need the United States. We can't rely on them anyway. So don't be so shit scared of China, because we've just mentioned earlier on, how many neighbours have they got to deal with? their focus is in their defence of in that South China Sea. They don't want them. They're building up a capacity so that America can't come across and invade them. And America can't now. Like they couldn't do it. So that's been their focus, and it's an understandable one given their history. And from our point of view, if we spend what is an amount of money that's not out of the ballpark, we can easily defend this country.
China
against them
are
without-
decreasing the amount that they spend on military as well in recent
Decreasing,
decreasing.
You mean as a percentage?
It's a percentage of their GDP.
yeah.
right?
But it's still quite a lot, isn't it, that they're spending?
It's only like 6% or something. I don't think it's as
They're building ships at a rapid rate. They're acquiring aircraft. Their army is only about, is it 2 million? Something like that?
They've got
Which
the
is
big,
still quite a lot, but in a population of, 1.3 something billion.
their army is bigger than any other army in terms of
about-
manpower.
I think it's about 2 million, but I'm not sure.
So, okay, so that's one other thing, just Belt and Road. It's really hard to get an idea of what is this Belt and Road, but it seems to be where China is saying to other countries, we'll help you build a bigger port, a bigger piece of infrastructure, we'll lend you money. And we've been critical of them in the past on the podcast because it seems with some poorer countries, they've said, here's a big bunch of money, and the poorer country can't repay it, and under that it gets forfeited, and the Chinese end up owning the port.
Like they do in Sri Lanka now.
Yeah. So it looks like Daniel Andrews in Victoria has signed some sort of non-binding agreement under the Belt and Road scheme with China. So from what I've read, he's not actually committed to anything except to say, I like the idea of Belt and Road. Now, if all it is China lending money for infrastructure, then just don't borrow more than you can handle and you'll be fine. Like, the Chinese invest in things all
My
the time.
concern there is that I can't remember which body it is, but they've asked Daniel Andrews to hand over the details of the agreement that he signed,
Right.
and a lot of it was blacked out. And he said, "You don't need to know the details."
Good on him.
As he would.
Good on him.
Well,
So he's
people are pointing
keeping
out that
secrets
the federal government is not
of
that.
deals he's done with China.
Yeah, even the federal government is
Well, it
pretty
sold the
unhappy
Port of
with-
Darwin to China,
I know they did.
so they can hardly complain.
Well, it's a 99-year lease.
Yeah, well,
Sounds
in-
like Hong Kong. all
in
over.
any event, they can hardly complain when Daniel Andrews says, I'm going to do an infrastructure deal with China. They go, oh, you can't do that. Wait a minute, you just sold the Port of
But I
Darwin to
still
them.
I think they have reason to complain, to say, well, if you've signed a deal, let's see it.
Well, he
I mean,
says,
if the federal government sold a port in Darwin to the Chinese, there'd be
we
sort of
found-
non-disclosure, and all of the deal that they signed, information would be ready available to everyone, I'd imagine, under that.
Look,
after it all happened, Daniel Andrews will say to it, I'll tell you what I've done, and I've done it. So,
There's something I read about these.
Well, he signed the agreement. He should.
yeah, but the agreement is a legally binding agreement that allows Victorian infrastructure experts to get access to the hundreds of billions of dollars of projects slated for Belt and Road. Like, he actually hasn't committed to anything. It's just a memorandum of understanding.
Memorandum of understanding.
I read just in the last couple of days something about investment, infrastructure investment in the South Pacific region. Australia is far and away the biggest donor of aid money to the South Pacific countries. Far and away the biggest.
Above China,
Above China, way above China.
well then,
But
our aid budget
But-
is a fraction of what it was.
the point was made. Yeah, our aid
We made a
budget.
60 billion saving through the week.
Yeah,
Our,
yeah,
aid,
yeah.
our aid budget has gone down over the last number of
Since
years.
Julie Bishop.
But it's still far, far more than China. The point that was made in the article I read was Australia gives aid for things like schools and hospitals and stuff that are sort of blended into the landscape. China gives big lumps of money to build something like a new parliament building in somewhere like Samoa or somewhere
I
like
thought it was
that.
more like dams or railroads or,
Well,
or
it's big,
infrastructure.
flashy infrastructure projects with
Things that provide water and electricity and
which
stuff like
stand out. In other words, people look at it and go, "Oh, where did that come from?"
Yep.
Oh, China gave us the money for that. Whereas the Australian government and the New Zealand government, I should
subtle.
mention, are giving money all over the place, but people don't notice it as much, because it's in things that just blend into the landscape.
That's interesting.
Right. Predictions for China for the future. Anybody got any predictions?
Don't we have to decide, is it a communist state or not? We
I've
haven't
already
done that.
decided.
We've decided.
Have we?
You're outvoted there, mate.
No, I haven't decided, because I was thinking about this and it occurred to me that as we discussed, if you want to, even though there are private companies in China, some of them quite big ones, they are still under the thumb of the Communist Party. So in a sense, all land in China is basically state-owned, okay? So you were talking about ownership of the means of production by the people. It still exists. It's still real. And even if you buy a property, even though, ownership of land and apartments and things like that has loosened up and has become better in China in recent years, but you still ultimately, you don't own it. It's like a lease.
Can I give some more statistics?
Yeah.
In 2018,
Sorry, can I just finish my point?
well,
Because it's about communists and why I think it is a
yeah,
communist
but you've
party.
given a statement about ownership and it's wrong.
I haven't finished my point.
Okay.
My point is that I think the Communist Party have basically decided that if the old system of central control of the economy wasn't really moving fast enough or getting the results they wanted, they thought, okay, we'll do it a different way. We'll pretend that people privately own their own companies. Of course, they ultimately, if we want to take it back,
We could.
because the law is basically Communist Party law, it's not a separate legal system like we have here, they can change the law whenever they want. They can requisition or take possession of whatever they want, whenever they want, basically. So even though there's this veneer of a capitalist economy, and it is a sort of a capitalist economy, ultimately, the Communist Party and the Chinese state still owns everything. So my reckoning is, yes, it is definitely still a communist system. They've just decided to do it a little bit differently.
They don't own everything. Private enterprise has expanded enormously with around 30 million private businesses recorded in 2008. In 2018, private enterprises in China accounted for 60% of GDP, 80% of urban employment, and 90% of new jobs. You might say, oh, the Communist Party can just take all that away.
They can.
But they can't, because it's bigger than the party and powerful people will throw them out. They don't want this. The powerful people in the party own this shit. So they don't want the party suddenly taking this stuff away from individuals because they might be one of the victims. So
Yes, but it's not gonna happen.
It's not in their interest to say, oh, you know what, let's just suddenly start taking private stuff away from people under an authoritarian rule, because they own enough personal stuff now that they're at risk of having that taken off them.
Yes,
so that's
but it
not,
doesn't
they
have to
can't
happen,
do it.
Trevor.
You might say
It doesn't have to happen.
You might say, oh, they can just take it off them. But when you've got powerful people donating money, massaging relationships,
Part of the system.
networking, you can't just say, Xi Jinping cannot simply say, I'm not happy with the owner of Alibaba, I'm taking that business. He can't.
Really?
No.
You should check out what happened at Alibaba
because
about a year ago.
You should understand how power works when you've got... You're suggesting that the 658 billionaires in China have no power.
I wouldn't say they have no power.
No, you're saying they don't have enough power to stop the Communist Party.
If
And
the Communist Party
and the
decides
the
they're on
answer
the
is
wrong
the
side of
people
it,
making the decision
they're
in the
finished.
Communist Party are part of that 658
Mm-hmm.
billionaires, and they're not about to start pushing a rock down a hill where suddenly the party can start confiscating private assets because they're in the firing line.
Okay. They're not going to do it very often, Trevor, because they don't need to. It's like everybody knows the way things work. So they know if they push too hard in the wrong direction, they're going to be in trouble. So they, you know, it's just that threat hanging over them all the time. They don't need to, take over a company
you're
very
basically saying any authoritarian state is communist.
often. No, I'm not.
Well, because any authoritarian state could steal private property,
Yeah.
therefore it is communist.
Yeah, but what my point
So
is...
you are saying that.
No, my point is that they still ultimately, the Chinese state ultimately still owns the means of production.
No,
they've just rented it out.
It's strong in energy production and heavy industries, but private enterprise owns everything else.
Yeah, they call it private
so
enterprise,
you're
but
really-
ultimately it's all owned
But
by
you're
the
just
Chinese
saying
state.
any authoritarian state, any dictatorship is communist.
No, I'm not.
Because you're saying at any point it can take the means of production off private individuals.
No.
Because that's what you're saying is what makes China communist.
No, I'm not. I'm saying it started communist, and it's still communist because they've just basically massaged the way that they own and control everything. In other words, they don't do it directly like in the old Marxist-Leninist model, but they still ultimately still own it because...
I don't think you're going to make any headway there.
Well,
There's two parts to
don't
the
you know
definition of
Alibaba-
communism, by the way.
Alibaba, okay, I know communism is about the whole country owning the means of production.
No, there's
Alibaba-
another part to it. There's another part
Yeah,
to
I know.
communism.
But something happened with Alibaba a couple of years ago, didn't it? I'm sure there was something. I read something and I don't remember the details.
Come back with it.
But that guy Ma, who owns the company, he was on the losing end of something that happened in the last
He's
year
a
or two.
bit of a figurehead now, is he? But the two parts to the communism definition is a theory or system of social organisation which all property is owned by the community. And the second part to the definition is, and each person contributes and receives according to their ability and their needs. Now, I don't think everyone in China contributes according to their ability and their needs.
Yeah, but that never happens in any society.
Honestly, Paul, if you took Marx in a time machine and plopped him in China and said, the 12th man reckons this is communism, tell me he wouldn't burst out laughing. Tell me.
He'd be very surprised, but let's face it, Marx died in the 19th century. He'd be surprised by a whole lot of things.
Tell me how this works. He'd say private enterprise, 60% of GDP, 80% of urban employment, 90% of new jobs.
The fact that it's so successful
30 million private
tells me that
businesses.
it's not
He'd
communism.
go, don't know that this is... He would say it's on the road. You know what he'd say?
What would he say?
He'd say, this is actually on the road to communism. Because Marx...
Socialism is on the road to communism.
No, Marx recognised that peasant economies could not move directly to communism. His theory was that they had to become industrialised and private enterprise and some sort of...
In other words, they go through a phase of capitalism.
They had to become industrialised through a phase of capitalism. And then, having achieved a state of industrialisation, they could then go back to move to a situation of socialism and communism. So Marx...
No, I think, hang on, I've got it here. In Marxist theory, socialism is a transitional social state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realisation of communism.
Yeah,
so
but
if
you're
you're
forgetting...
in a capital state and you want to move towards communism, you've got to go through a transitional phase called
But you've got to remember,
socialism.
he was looking at peasant societies and said the peasant society had to move to an industrial capitalist society and then back to socialism and then communism. So there was a step from peasantry that had to go to an industrial society. In his mind, you could not go from peasant to communism. You had to go via industrial capitalism. So
Just
Marx
the fact that Chinese economy is so successful tells me that it's not communism.
well, Marx-
that's
Marx-
the hallmark of communism, isn't
So-
it? People starve.
So Marx would look at it and he would go, Mao, wrong, told you so. You don't go from peasant to communism. Modern China, it's on track. this is what you have to do, and then you'll be able to head towards communism. That's what Marx would
Yeah,
say.
but
But
I
he would not say,
suspect-
he wouldn't look at it now and go, "Oh, you've achieved it,
I
comrade."
suspect Marx would get a shock if he visited any so-called
Marx might think,
communist country.
once you've taken over the world and you've got world domination, then you can implement
You know what
communism.
Marx, though, would look at today's capitalist society and the neoliberal experiment and the ruination that's happening in America and elsewhere with,
Ruination.
yes, with drugs like, simple drugs like, what do you use for diabetes? Insulin. Unaffordable in America. This sort of thing. Marx understood how power worked and how capitalists would screw people. He understood it before anybody. Now, you might criticise his utopian view of what an eventual communist society would be, but he understood how power worked and how America, in a sense, he would look at America today and go, "Fucking told you so."
And what about Australia? If he visited Australia, what would he say?
He,
What a mess!
so,
Look what the neoliberals have done to you people.
so he would say, "Well done, comrades. You're on the road to communism because you've now industrialised. You can actually." That's what he would say.
Okay.
But he, there you go, dear listener. Have we made it to 2 hours? 2 hours
Already?
54
Oh my
seconds.
goodness.
The future, let's look forward.
Oh yeah. Okay. Oh, well, you wanted this. You put this down in the notes.
Yeah. Wouldn't you like to be able to crystal ball that? There's definitely cause for concern.
In
It's
China.
concerned for what? For who? For what? For
well,
why?
for Australia, I
About
think
Becoming a vassal state.
right.
a tribute state. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, they are a rising superpower. Economically, they're going to be bigger than the United States, and in some regards, they already are. I think future wars will be fought economically, not with military. So it won't matter how big the US's army is, or how small the Chinese army is. They'll find other means of dominating their power in Western civilizations. We know that they're not a fan of democracy, free speech, human rights, or justice. And all of those things the United States actually stands for.
Oh,
So,
next week. Okay.
please. For all of its,
I've got so much work to do on you. Was.
for all of its faults,
Please.
for all of its faults,
Have you looked at the
might be-
gerrymandering? Have you,
it might
please.
be a it might be
But
better
what
to
were those
deal
again? Say those again.
democracy, free speech,
Yeah.
human rights,
Yeah.
and justice.
Put it in
Justice.
and twist it.
Justice.
I'm not saying any of those things are perfect.
Human
Trevor.
rights. Yeah.
I'm not saying any of those
Do you
things are
seriously
perfect.
think that all those things are better in China than in the United States,
Just-
Trevor?
But we've gone 2 hours. You say what it stands for. Why did you pick the US? Couldn't you have picked any?
No,
you
well,
could
we're
have picked
talking about
Australia.
we're talking about a rising
You
superpower.
could have picked Australia for those things to a large extent. Okay.
We're talking about the battle between America and
good and
China
evil?
to be the world superpower.
Right.
Not necessarily good and evil, but it's a different ideological viewpoint.
And I don't think there's any question that the American society and culture is for democracy a lot more than China is. I mean, there's no real argument there. They're much for free, much
Bearing in
more
mind,
for
though,
free speech.
bearing in mind what we've said about Chinese culture and its recognition of unequal hierarchical relationships and the desire for harmonious, prosperous economy and civilization above personal.
Yeah, but that's not
freedom
our
to-
culture, is it?
I know.
We
but it
don't have
doesn't-
a shared culture. We wouldn't have a shared culture with the
I know,
dominant
but when you're
world superpower, which is not a good position to be in.
But when you're saying, okay, so you're saying it from the point of view of which system, because you're right, you couldn't impose that system on us. We wouldn't accept it in
No.
the same way that our system imposed on them may not
because
work.
of our different cultures.
Yes.
And
So-
we're not
so
saying
we're
I'm not saying that ours
so
is better or
culturally-
worse. I'm just saying
So
it's
culturally, we're closer to the USA. than
Yeah.
China. I'll agree with you there.
Yeah.
Yes, we'd find it more uncomfortable to be dominated by China than America. I'll give you that.
I think the only thing really that
A concession from Trevor. Did you hear that?
have you ever got one of those?
I'm not sure. Well done, was it?
Maybe I would make an all right diplomat. Justice? Do you think? Do you have more faith in the American justice system than you do in the?
They're both
Chinese?
unjust.
They're
Oh,
both
come on,
unjust.
Trevor.
But we're talking levels here. I mean,
We've
we're not
already
talking
had a
black, It's
discussion
not a black
weeks-
and white discussion
we had
where
a-
one's good and one's bad. We're trying to choose the lesser of two evils here.
Yeah.
Where would you rather stand trial, in America or in China?
Am I black in Alabama on a rape trial?
Not talking about race. We're just talking about you're in trouble with the government.
Am I a Uyghur in China?
Good point.
Am I black in Alabama? Am I a wealthy tech guy in San Francisco, or am I a princeling in China?
Did the Uyghurs get a trial?
My point is, depends who you are.
Did the Uyghurs even get a trial? No.
Do you not understand the injustices that occur in America?
We
Right.
know
If-
the
if you-
injustices in America.
So what I'm saying is
But they
there
have
are
a legal
injustices in both. It depends on your position in society in each case. So I would rather be a princeling in China or than a black man in Alabama on a rape trial. So
That's a
depending,
really strange comparison.
well, you asked.
princeling?
You asked about.
A princeling is a very
But
highly privileged member of the Chinese elite.
Without
here's
going
here's my
into
point.
identity,
Here's my
if
point.
you were if you were an average American or an average Chinese,
Yes, that's a better comparison.
right, right.
without
And you got into trouble with the government.
Right.
Where would you rather?
What am I in trouble over?
Where would you rather take on the government in a law court?
What am I
in
in
China or in America?
What am I in trouble over?
Oh, I don't know, just some, dispute over land title, or maybe the government wanted to develop
Okay,
your
I would-
your land, and they told you to
Okay.
get lost.
Okay, I'd rather be in America.
Absolutely.
Okay, now if I was had a compromised immune system, and I lived in a busy metropolis city, and I was fearful that if I got coronavirus, I would die, would I rather be in China or would I rather be in New York
Yeah.
as a poor person in New York?
Yeah.
A worker cleaning the subway, or a poor person in Wuhan as a worker cleaning the subway? Which one would I rather be, hoping to live longer? I'd rather be in Wuhan.
Possibly.
So
Simply
just,
because
you
we know
you
the
can-
American medical system is so stuffed.
Yeah. So,
but we don't know. I mean, we're going to talk about COVID-19 next week.
So-
I hope, but I mean, we don't have any confidence of the numbers coming out. We don't
We're
know
gonna
how
talk about that
we don't
next
know
week.
how bad COVID-19 is in China. I don't
Actually,
think
Craig
any country.
Craig contacted me,
Yeah.
and he's going to hopefully come on next
Oh,
week.
good. Oh, good.
Yes, and we're going to talk about your flu theories.
Yeah. The kung
Please,
flu.
let's not do that now. But I'm just making the point. It depends on your situation. So at times. So look, obviously there are enormous problems in
Free
China,
speech?
but you've got to.
Doesn't exist in China.
Yeah. So free speech. You'd rather be in America.
Absolutely.
So.
And it is important, isn't it? Free speech. You agree with that proposition?
Yeah, but there are also poor people in America working for $7.50 an hour on 2 jobs, and their partner has to do the same. And if they've got kids, then one does a night shift, the other does a day shift, and they might see each other on a Sunday afternoon.
Would you
And-
rather be the
and-
poorest of the
and
poor
so-
in China
so
or the
I'm-
poorest of the poor in the United States?
In terms of living conditions, I've seen some terrible living conditions in America.
Okay. Would you rather be the poorest of the poor Chinese or the poorest of the poor American?
I'd rather be the poorest of the.
The lowest ranking.
They're both so terrible. one is sleeping under a bridge in a snowy Michigan winter, and another one is slaving away in a paddy field. Like, how do you compare them?
I
Like-
think you have better social mobility in America than what you would in China.
I know. Okay, so social mobility in America is terrible. It's one of the great myths of the world.
I'm not saying it's good, but I think it's still better than
Do you know,
China.
if you had a really bright kid in China, you'd be guaranteed he could get to a good education, maybe more so than America.
Do you think?
Quite
know-
possibly.
Universities in China, entrance is extremely competitive. And not everybody gets in.
Yeah.
It's not like here, where if you want to go to university, pretty much, yeah.
What about
you can
corruption,
go.
Trevor?
They're both corrupt.
Yeah, I know they're
I think
both corrupt, but
they're both corrupt.
we're choosing between the lesser of two evils.
They're equally as corrupt.
Equally as corrupt.
Of course they are.
I think China's way more corrupt.
How do you
than
know?
The US.
In
I
what
don't
way?
know.
Well, you can open a bar in an American city and, you know, your business will do well or it won't do well, depending on, you know, a number of factors mainly determined by how well you run it. In China, you can't just go and open a business.
I was thinking more of a corruption at a higher level where we're talking millions of dollars. So in terms of Defence Department contracts.
It's all the way down in China.
So in terms of Defence Department contracts, that sort of multi-million-dollar level, that's where it would, at the lower level of paying off for protection, I don't know, in China, yes, you've got to pay your local communist guy, but who knows, that could be just like a tax that you pay, I don't know.
I think if we were to have a
But we don't know these
Chinese
things, we're
person
just
on
guessing.
the podcast tonight to talk about China, and we nearly did have that.
Yeah,
thanks to
But that's just
the
one,
12th man.
one person's...
If they were to say disparaging comments about the Chinese Communist Party, and they had family or, you know, nearest and dearest
Very dangerous.
still living in China, it would be very brave of them to come on here, not use an alias, and speak truthfully about their feelings about the Chinese Communist Party. Whereas if you had a Republican come onto the podcast, they could say
I don't think Trevor would accept it.
whatever they want about America, or a Democrat, sorry, if they had a Democrat on here, they could bag Trump out
Absolutely.
as
And
much as you want with no
absolutely
fear.
nothing would happen to them
No fear of
or their family.
That is quite true. Give you that. Freedom of speech, absolutely.
Got 2 concessions in one night from Trevor.
Give you, like, so, look, I'm not
You
saying...
jealous?
I'm not
You're a legend, was
I'm not suggesting China is a utopia.
No, and I'm not suggesting United States is a utopia.
Okay, so that's where I push
I
back.
used to,
and
I used
say,
to think in the 80s, a kid growing up in the 80s, I used to look at the USA with such envy. You know, the movies and the TV programs and the culture. I just thought that looks like a fantastic place. I would not want to live there now. Like I just look at them with pity now. The Americans, like they've gone from a country that I envy to a country that I pity within 20 years.
because you've come to understand it. Yep.
And I think they've changed a lot.
But you'd still rather move to America. If you had to move and you're only given 2 options, the United States or China, which one would you choose?
Finland.
No, hey,
Of course.
No,
How
the United
wealthy
States,
are you?
The United States.
how wealthy are you with this move?
How wealthy?
Yeah.
I
you've
think
got-
regardless.
You've got to, do you know how many school shootings there are every week in America? I don't understand why people who can
Don't
afford
go
to...
to school in America.
I can't
If you
understand
do, take a gun.
why people who have got school-age children who could afford to leave America, I don't understand why they're still there. Like,
There's a lot wrong with America. We know that.
yeah, they're not going to be shot in school in China.
Although there have been attacks with knives by crazy people in China who
course,
go into schools and kill children.
Of course they have, but there haven't been Sandy Hooks every week like there has been in America.
Here's my worry for the future. This is what I wanted to get at.
Oh, okay.
With China, there's relative stability there
Yep.
because of the progress.
Yes.
But the progress has got to stop at some point. And when that does, I think there's going to be another revolution, or at least an attempted revolution. in China by the Chinese people.
Okay, but that could happen anywhere.
Mm.
America could have a revolution,
Yeah, but I think it's more likely in China.
right? And is that a bad thing?
I think it'll be like it'll have a ripple effect on the world because of the, it will then be the biggest nation in the world economically. Probably by that stage it might even be twice the size
But
of
if,
America.
if you're worried about
economically.
the risk of an economic collapse of a major power,
Mm.
arguably you've got a bigger risk of America collapsing and causing a
Well,
bigger
in a
bigger
couple of
ripple.
years' time, I don't think it's going to be the biggest power anyway. And
Yeah,
by
but-
some measures, it's not.
and its
already.
chances of collapsing are perhaps even higher.
Mm.
So
Do you know
but
what the
our dependence on China, Australia's dependence on China, is a lot more than our dependence on America. I mean, we rely on America militarily, but in terms of our trade, China is 38% or about a third,
can I give you a corruption index?
whereas America is about 4%. So, if stuff happens in China, we feel it in Australia much more than we feel anything negative
Sure.
if
Sure,
shit goes down in
we're
the
connected
US.
What about
more.
debt to GDP? Do you look at that? Is that significant? Because China has a very high debt to GDP rate at the moment.
Nothing like America's.
Or
I think it
Japan's.
is.
But American debt's huge.
So is China's.
Not compared to China.
I think it is.
No.
It's huge.
And the American debt's way worse. Just on corruption, Davina in the chat room says there's an index. Oh, Davina, yes. China rates 41 out of 100, and the US is 69 out of 100, with 100 being very clean and 0 being
right?
highly corrupt.
So those numbers again, Trevor?
That's good
China is
input, Davina.
41
Yeah.
out of 100. US is 69 out of 100.
Corruption.
Yes.
69 is worse than 41, I take
No,
it.
no, no. 40, 60, 100 is very clean. 0 is highly corrupt.
I thought, I thought.
Okay.
Tricked me.
So the US
I
is
thought the US was more corrupt than
the
China.
US
according
is
to that.
less corrupt. It scores 69. China scores 51.
Oh, okay.
41.
Thanks for backing
about
me up there,
Australia?
Davina.
But Davina, what's the Australian one? Just please. And make it quick because we're winding up in 2 minutes
And
because we're already at
Oh my God.
we're,
2 hours and 18 minutes or
Yeah.
something already.
you know what I think?
Yeah, I think we've destroyed our career in politics. I think tonight, but Trevor's still got a
Ready to
chance.
please. Dun, dun, dun.
He's open for donations from
Look,
wealthy Chinese businessmen.
should we chop this up into 2 episodes? Can we come back next? Oh, there's a lot going on. We'll be back next week.
There is a lot going on.
Yeah. Davina, start typing. You've got 10 seconds. Right. Okay.
Yeah. Who
Well,
else is hanging in there at this point?
anyway,
Is
I think that's
anybody
been.
else?
Davina, thank you. 77 for Australia.
Yay.
69
Aussie,
for the
Aussie,
US.
Aussie.
41 for China.
Terrific.
Right on. There we go. Well, 7 people have stayed with us. We were as high as 16 at one point. It's been
Thanks
a
to those
marathon
7.
effort.
I'm sure they've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it.
I think it was interesting.
Yeah,
It was worth doing. Good to understand
We've
China a bit more.
absolutely-
decreased our ignorance,
Yes, we'll learn
which
something.
has a ripple effect where we no longer project poorly.
Yes.
And what was the other thing? We're no longer as fearful.
Yeah. Meanwhile, we disagree just as much as we did at the beginning, despite all that.
But was it got 2 concessions from Trevor? I don't know how you do it, Warren.
It's more reasonable than you.
It's called being a beer sponsor.
Righto, dear listener. Probably see you next week, unless I decide to split this into 2. But anyway, all right. See ya. Bye.
Yeah, see
Bye,
you guys.
everyone.